Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. We're very excited to welcome for the first time Nick Kadysh, founder and CEO of PharmAla Biotech, ticker MDMA. It's hard sometimes, you get going and get ready to go.
It's all good.
But excited to spend some time talking about the company, what is going on in the world of psychedelic medicine, and of course, get some company updates as well as we go along. If you are out there, one, always thanks for joining. We really appreciate it. But two, if you are invested in psychedelics, if you're interested in psychedelics, if any of this is sort of interesting to you or relevant to you, definitely recommend taking some time to both like this video to kind of boost it in the space, but also two, get direct access to somebody who's in the space and ask any questions that you have. So good reminder, let me put that out there as we go. But Nick, thanks for joining. How's your day so far? I know we were joking that it's a boring day in the market.
Yeah, boring day in the market. I was joking that we make a therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it certainly seems that there's a whole bunch of people on Wall Street and Bay Street in Canada who are going to be calling us for treatment after today's events.
It is definitely rough out there for sure. Oh, I like this. Is this a good nickname? Mr. MDMA is pretty solid.
Mr.
There you go. You could adopt it.
I have been called worse. Yes, that's correct.
I like it. Good branding. Well, so again, because it's your first time on, I feel like people are familiar with you, but would love to sort of start with your background, how you got into the space, how you decided to found a company like this, and kind of work through on that front first.
Yeah, sure. I got my start in the Canadian government years and years and years ago, like on Parliament Hill. And then for about a decade, I worked in a bunch of different industries, but always on the leading edge of what was permissible by health regulators. So I did some time working for Red Bull. I did some time working on medical devices at General Electric, which sounds boring, but is actually fascinating. I spent some time working at Juul Labs, the vaping company. And so basically near the tail end of my time with Juul, I saw, I read, because I'm a weird, boring dude, I read like medical literature. And we saw all of these clinical trials coming out with just like really, really fantastic results in an area where there had really been nothing. I mean, psychiatric pharmacology, the last major innovation was like Prozac, and that was like the late 80s. That's a long, long time. And so we basically, we got into it. We decided we're going to start a company. And originally the company was just going to basically make better versions of MDMA. Novel molecules, drug discovery, very classic stuff. But about 6 months in, we started getting all these calls from researchers, and they said, it's great that you're developing this new stuff. And we still do that today. But can you make some MDMA? Please, for God's sake, make MDMA. We need it for our clinical research. And so today we basically do three things. We're the only company that makes MDMA for commercial purposes. So in Canada and in Australia, our MDMA is used to treat patients, like by doctors with prescriptions. Two, we provide MDMA for clinical trials all over the world. USVA, the US military, Harvard, Yale, pretty much everybody who's doing clinical research. All the Ivy Leagues are clients. And then we do our own research. So we still do develop novel molecules, and we still do test them and all that fun stuff.
So best of all worlds, kind of ultimately. I think you must be super, excited. I feel like, Australia coming online, putting more focus into the research element. I know a lot of the schools, like you're saying, the Ivies have definitely put more focus into it. It's something that's been around for a while, but I think there's been definitely a real, resurgence in general in terms of focus there, which is great. Because you're right. I think looking at some of the studies that have come out, it does seem like the results that you can get are surprising, and I think pretty positive, which is great. I do want to back up a little bit. So it sounds like you had found the interest in psychedelic medicine early on. How did you originally first focus on MDMA? Because I know there's a lot out there. There's psilocybin, ketamine, even.
Basically, like there's really only two reasons. The first is, we came to this from the drug discovery side. So we really saw it as like, where can we really have impact and change the molecule? And we were really looking at safety. Like, can we make this safer and better? MDMA is actually relatively safe already, except if you have a heart condition. And that kind of knocks out anyone over the age of 60. Like everyone over the age of 60 has some cardiac stuff, some vascular stuff. And if you look at the clinical trials, that's who's been sort of kept out. So we're like, hey, listen, if we can just open up the market for 60 plus people, there's a lot of people who are 60 plus who have PTSD. Like that's already good enough, right? That's plenty. You don't actually need to change much to have a pretty big impact on a population level. So that's how we sort of started with MDMA. And then the other thing about MDMA is there's a lot of focus on psilocybin mushrooms, and that's great. I'm happy for those people. We're a synthetic drug company. And part of the reason why we're the only people in the world who are doing this is you can't grow MDMA. It doesn't grow on a tree. You have to make it in a pharmaceutical lab. You have to make it to GMP standards. And it creates a little bit of a moat. I mean, I'm sure there would be lots of other companies doing this if it was that easy to do. Growing mushrooms, I would, obviously I'm biased, but I would say relatively easier than making a pharmaceutical drug product.
Yeah, that's fair. You need a green thumb. You don't need a giant lab with a lot of technical and beakers and everything else. I guess that makes sense.
Totally. And really it's the regulatory. I make this joke all the time, but we don't actually sell MDMA. What we actually sell is 600 pages of regulatory documentation that goes along with the MDMA.
Yeah, that tracks. And again, I think you having a background kind of on that policy sort of regulatory side must inform
Definitely.
and kind of help, I guess, along the ways.
Definitely.
Okay, that's super interesting. In terms of the drug development side and in terms of being able to, create novel compounds and things like that, what are you most focused on? Is it more sort of duration based? Is it just creating a repeatable experience? Anything that you can share kind of on that end?
No, of course, of course. Okay, so this is like super interesting stuff. So if I go like way too wild on it, please let me know. But MDMA is like a super interesting drug. Basically, when the MDMA that we generally think of, it's a racemic molecule, meaning you create two versions of the MDMA molecule, and they're like my hands. So like they're mirror images of one another, right? And regular MDMA is like a 50-50 mix. Turns out, though, that's not the ideal mix for human beings. The ideal mix is actually somewhere closer to like 75-25. 75% R-MDMA, which is the one, and then 25% S-MDMA, which is the other. And we figured that out because we tested like every fucking combination possible. A lot of rodents got very, very happy while we were testing. But so we basically patented that mixture. We looked at all of them. That was the best one. And that was our first major innovation. What you got out of that was you got a molecule that was safer. It was more efficacious, especially for treating sort of some variation of social anxiety. And social anxiety is, especially post-COVID, huge problem. So that was sort of our first innovation. And then, we have a drug discovery model, a computer model, AI model, whatever you want to call it. We do look for other molecules that are sort of related to MDMA. We have a bunch that we patented. And so now we're sort of getting further and further away. But our sort of North Star is always the same, which is number one, increase safety. And then number two, can we get better effects?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's interesting. I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on sort of the perceptions around MDMA, because I think a lot of the time people can view it obviously as more of a party drug or something like that. And there can be dangers, I think, in terms of.
I don't just have opinions. I have data. We've commissioned polling.
Okay. Yeah. What's that? What can you share from that?
Yeah, sure. So really remarkable. So in addition to my work at PharmAla Biotech, I'm the board chair of SciCan, which is the trade association of Canadian medical psychedelic companies. There's for-profit medical psychedelic companies in Canada, of which there's a bunch. I think most psychedelics companies are at least incorporated in Canada, first listed on the public markets in Canada for a whole bunch of reasons. And the trade association SciCan, we commissioned polling. This is a couple of years ago now, and it was really remarkable. So about 60% of the population, and this cuts across political lines entirely, if you say this is like psychedelics, but to be used in medical circumstances to treat like psychiatric disorders, how do you feel about that? 60 to 70% of the population all across the board says, yes, we're great with that. Hardcore conservatives, religious, not religious, people do not care as long as it is used in medical situation to treat a medical condition. And I think that kind of tracks. I don't know how people feel about opioids, but like if you've just had surgery, they feel pretty damn good about them.
Yes, I think there are appropriate uses of them and applications, and I think as long as they're being controlled and kind of researched and studied appropriately, I think that makes sense. That's really interesting in sort of the consortium element. Is that just public companies? Is that companies? I mean.
Nope.
Okay, a whole mix.
Any company, it has to be for profit and it has to be medical. So if you're after sort of like like there's a company called Red Light Holland, and they've made some like lots of comments about. Sorry,
I think we have their light. Oh, that was not a hand raise. I think we have their light from Red Light Holland behind us.
The hat. Yeah, sure.
Which is good.
No, so it's like Todd's a great guy, but he's made quite a bit of noise about how he believes that there should be a recreational market for psilocybin. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But our trade association is not for recreational. We are entirely just medical companies.
Yep, I think that makes sense. But I do think there has to be some sort of relationship between recreational and medical, just because I think it can like if somebody has a bad experience on the recreational side, I'm sure it creates, Different.
And look, part of the reason why these drugs have so much interest in the medical field is because, despite the fact that they were illegal, and in many cases still are, there was a lot of recreational use, right? So, in no way am I denying that there's a recreational use
Yeah,
for these drugs.
sure.
That's just not what we do as a company, and that's not what the association does.
I think that makes sense. So it sounds like stigma or acceptance for the medical side of psychedelics is not really an impediment to
Not a
kind of growth
problem.
in the space. Is there anything
No.
that you would point to as like, this is really a barrier? Because I think we've seen a lot of growth so far, which has been great, but what's the
Yeah,
next thing to kind of overcome to make
yeah.
the space bigger?
We talked about the people who are fine with it, which is sort of 60, 70% of the population are great with it. You know who's not great with it? Regulators.
Uh,
And so, look, we saw that with the Lycos application in the US with FDA
yes.
less than a year ago.
Mhm.
I spent a lot of time doing this kind of work, and I think if you get into the mind of a regulator, it's a little bit weird, right? But think about it this way: if somebody goes out and gets like PTSD therapy with MDMA that they bought on the black market, that's not my problem, right?
Mhm.
Like that's a problem for the police. But
Yeah.
if I've allowed this treatment, then it's on me, right? And so it's always easier to just say no.
Mhm.
Um, and even in countries like Canada, where we have the ability to treat patients, unfortunately, it's like, the system here is called special access. It's a very cumbersome, very slow system. And it's really designed to like as a break on additional people coming through and getting treated.
Interesting. In Canada, I know in the US, there's a ton of, I think, veterans specifically that do try to leave the US to try to get
Yeah.
treatment, seek treatment in other areas, South
Yeah.
America, a lot of the time. Is that true also in Canada? Or, like you're saying, is there some amount of allowance that allows
No,
them to kind of?
there is some
Okay.
amount of allowance. I think last year there was something like 500 patients treated.
Okay.
Still
Yeah.
pretty small numbers though, considering 40 million people. Could be better.
That's true.
And certainly we've seen a lot of people sort of get denied for weird reasons, and then they appeal and they get. But like, think about it from a patient. You have PTSD. You've been suffering for a long time, and now you have to go through 9 months of bureaucratic hell to get access. Keep in
Yes.
mind, we allow medically assisted suicide in Canada,
That's
and that is easier to access. So could be better.
grim. All right, that's fair. But yeah, again, I think you were working towards finding better solutions, finding kind of relief for
Yes,
those people. So I think that's important work.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
would love to talk. So again, I think that is surprising on the regulator side. I understand what you're saying that it is easier to say no because I think even with the FDA stuff that we saw most recently, they
Yeah.
basically said we can't tell if there are more negative effects, so let's kind of defer and push it on.
Well,
Right?
yeah. What
Ultimately.
they actually said was, we don't know how much effect, like expectancy, so functionally placebo effect. It's like the other side of placebo effect. How much placebo versus expectancy is driving outcomes versus just the drug.
Mm,
And I have a slightly different view of it, which is we're not talking about like a physiological condition. I don't have a broken arm. You know what I mean?
yep.
Uh, to a certain extent, expectancy effect. If I'm feeling better from my psychiatric disorder, I don't care what caused it. I'm better. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And
No.
I do think that psychiatric research is really complicated because of this, because like, yes, what you will into being in your mind often comes into being.
What you focus on is kind of what, yeah, gets fed into. I think that all makes sense. Again, it's hard to pin down. And I think that's some of the, not issue with psychedelic medicine, but I think in explaining it, I think the science can really kind of trip people up. I think you do a great job of explaining it and making it easy to digest. But
Thank
I
you.
do, but I think it's hard. It's hard work. And I think you do a
Yeah,
good job. But so I think that's difficult. But I think also just sort of the ethereal nature of mental health is hard to pin down. But again, you do see it in
totally.
results. And I think you can see it in data.
Totally.
So I think it does come out
But
on the other side.
there's something to be said about the fact that the only sort of like of the sort of psychedelics, the only one that is actually approved and in use is ketamine, which is not was not approved for this purpose, right? Like it's approved as an anesthetic to be used in surgery, and we use it as a sort of a psychedelic treatment for depression, but it's all off-label use. If you tried to do a clinical trial with ketamine, it would have the same expectancy effect problems as MDMA or psilocybin or any of the other drugs that have a subjective effect that you could feel.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate reaction to the fact that there's not, good access to good options
Yeah,
yet. I think again, there's interest
yeah,
there and trying to get there,
yeah.
but it's a process along the way. I did want to talk a little bit about sort of on not regulation necessarily, but just sort of how
Mhm.
governments are treating psychedelic medicine. And it seems like Australia has warmed to it. Canada has warmed to it.
Yeah.
I know in the US,
Yep.
we have some changes definitely in our kind of administration that
Yep.
seems to be warming to it.
Yep.
What's sort of your take on kind of that element, sort of the government element
Yeah. So
front?
it is moving. It never moves fast enough for the people in the industry or the investors. Of course, everyone wants it to move faster, but it is moving in the right direction. There's
Mhm.
broader acceptance. Australia has the best model, in my opinion, because the Australian model is they authorize doctors, and once you're an authorized psychiatrist, you can build a clinic, you can treat many patients, you can write as many prescriptions as you want, and they have sort of like everyone's on board. The college, which is the regulatory body for the doctors, is on board, and the government is on board, and the doctors are on board. So it works really well. I would say Canada is sort of like not as good because we have the government in between the doctor and the patient, which is
Mhm.
not really the right place for doctors. That's not how the healthcare system works.
Sure.
US is moving like nicely. And I will say yesterday there was a comment in a marijuana moment. It's a
Mhm.
weird outlet, but that's fine. The VA secretary, the new VA secretary, made a number of comments about how the VA views psychedelic assisted therapy. Tons of pressure on the US VA to adopt novel therapies. And you mentioned it. There's a lot of veterans who are going sort of down south or to
Mhm.
Canada to get treated because they have a lack of access. I think in the Biden administration, their solve for that was basically just like do a bunch of clinical trials, and anyone who's interested, they can join the clinical trials. It's a
Mhm.
really expensive way to do it, but it's a solution. I give them credit for trying. But it certainly like it seems like they're making some great noise. And the new secretary of HHS, RFK Jr., has been very, very public about his support for novel psychedelic therapies.
Yeah.
So, we supply the VA their clinical trials with MDMA.
So it's
Um,
great.
so yeah, like we're very pleased. We want to do more of this work, and we're happy to see it sort of evolve.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Again, it seems like there's a huge, huge demand and a very urgent demand, I think, for those
Totally,
solutions today, basically.
totally.
In terms of the new administration coming in and sort of having at least headlines, I think, around psychedelics, right to try, all these things that I think
Yeah,
put a light on the space. How much do you think it helps from like an industry perspective? And then, of course, like from a company publicly listed, how does it
yeah.
help in terms of attracting investors and kind of being able to tell that story directly to them?
Um, so look, from a company perspective, we have a product to sell and we're selling it to like basically everybody. We're kind of the people to go to now if you are looking for MDMA for a clinical trial, which is very gratifying.
Mhm.
So I'm very pleased with how the company has evolved and how this regulatory environment has sort of suited us. I'd love to say that it was all because we have this like genius master plan, but to a certain extent, it's also just like right place, right time, right product, as it always is. Um, for an industry perspective, the industry itself has definitely faced a bunch of challenges. And I think part of that is just broader. Like the industry is really composed of two groups. We kind of do represent both. Like we are a manufacturer and we are a drug discovery company. Most companies are one or the other.
Mhm.
And so I think on the drug discovery side, the alignment is closer to just like generic biotech.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I mentioned in the green room too, the XBI, like the biotech index, is
Mhm.
at its lowest point in human history. It has never been this low. So on the one hand, like lots of bargains for investors. On the other hand, I think if you are in drug discovery, it's super hard out there, and not just for psychedelics, but like for any drug company.
Yeah, any biotech, I think definitely has
Yeah,
had trouble, especially with rates, I think as well. I mean, does not help
totally.
currently.
We're highly rate dependent. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's fair. Is there anything that you see kind of looking ahead through the rest of the year that does make sort of the sector, the industry, not more investable, but I guess more attractive to investors?
Yeah.
Anything kind of
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
horizon?
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Look, definitely, absolutely. So number one, there's an understand. So this is comments relates more to broader biotech than psychedelics, but it affects psychedelics as well.
Mhm.
There's this broader understanding with regulators now that we are being too slow in approving drugs. Like that is like definitely a thing, and it is a topic of conversation in Europe, at the FDA, at Health Canada. Like every regulator is talking about this. That's
Mhm.
one. Two, there's this understanding that we have not done enough on mental health and we need to do more.
Mhm.
And sort of the combination of those two things has driven like a lot of interest in CNS, central nervous system drugs, psychedelic drugs, obviously as well. I had a couple of investment bankers call me a little while ago, and they said, our thesis is CNS is the next big play in biotech. I don't know if they're right, but it does seem like that's where the industry is headed. So that's good. I mean, broadly speaking, I do think that rates do have to come down a little bit more before there's going to be a ton of interest.
Mhm.
But based on today's events, maybe we're in for a rate cut. Let's see.
That is very possible. That is very possible. I feel like when you're talking with investors, I'm sure obviously a lot of it is for obviously the investment opportunity and again, what you guys are
Yeah.
working on specifically and kind of
Yeah.
the catalyst that you're seeing potentially ahead. How much of it is also sort of people who, want to support the work itself as well? Just because I think it is a
Everyone.
theme. Okay, really?
Everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, like I don't think we have a single investor. And like, look, we have retail investors, of course. I
Of
don't
course.
know their minds, but
Mhm.
I don't think we have a single investor who is not absolutely committed to the sort of the mission and the idea behind the company.
Mhm.
Um, all those people exited. Like if if you're, I don't know how else to put this, but there's an easier way to make a buck. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And the same goes for me and my entire team, like at management.
Mhm.
You could go work for a SaaS company.
Mhm.
I don't think it's very mission driven work, but you could do it. We're all smart people. But no, everyone's really committed to the idea that we can solve one of the greatest problems humanity's ever faced. You wouldn't be doing it otherwise.
I think that makes sense. As depressing as it is, I do think almost everybody either themselves or knows somebody that has been deeply affected, whether however they sit on sort of the mental health spectrum of being affected negatively. And I think
Yeah,
if they've been able to see somebody have a positive effect from something
yeah,
like psychedelics, I feel like that makes a big difference and an impact.
yeah,
All right, that sounds interesting. In terms of sort of how you're competing against, but also with other,
yeah.
people in the space, what's sort of the balance right now? Is it more sort of in a collaborative, like you were talking about
Yeah,
earlier?
always collaborative, always
Okay.
collaborative. Well, look, I mean, I'm blessed to be able to say that like we really have no strong competition in what we do.
Mhm.
Like we're the only ones who are supplying the Canadian market. We're kind of like we've got a monopoly on supply in the U.S. market for clinical trials. So maybe I'm driven by that, but I really do believe like part of the reason I spend my personal time on the trade association, and it is a significant amount of my personal time.
Mhm.
I do believe that a rising tide lifts all ships. I don't think one company can sort of change the world. You kind of need to have everyone in the industry rowing in the same direction. It's
Mhm.
critically important. And you know what? If somebody can do this work better than I can, I welcome it. Every marketplace has like a Coke, a Pepsi, and a Dr. Pepper. So I'm happy to be any of those three. Right now, we're the Coca-Cola. That's cool. But if I have to be Pepsi, I'm fine with that too.
That sounds good. All right. I love that analogy. That's awesome. Do you see in the future more sort of consolidation in this space? Or do you see again, okay, is that coming ahead? Okay.
100%, yes.
Okay.
And we're always assessing opportunities for M&A, always assessing opportunities. Like, look, we had a close sort of colleague company, a partner company called Mindset Pharma. They got acquired by Otsuka a couple of years ago. Probably not as good a transaction as the principals in that company wanted, but it's still a pretty nice transaction.
Mhm.
It's never a bad time to exit as long as like your assets are still getting developed. Obviously I want to take care of my people and the principals in the company and make sure that we're still like working towards something good. But if the right people want to do this and they can drive it forward faster and better than we can, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't have an ego about this stuff.
That's fantastic. Again, I think that helps when you are working towards a good aim and sort of doing good work.
Totally,
All
totally.
right, fantastic. Is there also any eye on sort of not acquisition, I guess, generally, but I think I've seen a lot of more traditional, or what's your take, I guess, on the more traditional pharma getting into the space? I think I'd seen Johnson and Johnson do some acquisitions
Yeah.
recently.
Yep.
Does that come into play at all? What's your
All
thought
the
there?
time, all the time. The Mindset again, like Otsuka is a big pharma company. I think that a lot of the companies, like the big pharma companies, they are sitting by the sidelines because they don't think that we've hit bottom yet, which is a little bit concerning. I mean, like they don't have a crystal ball either, but a
Sure.
little bit concerning on the biotech side that they're not really like they should be jumping up and down and just like snapping up biotech companies left, right, and center. I
Mhm.
think in the next like it. The moment that there's an inflection point and prices start going back up, I think there's going to be a wave of acquisition on the part of big pharma gobbling up small pharma like
Mhm.
you cannot believe. Because at that point, it becomes a FOMO thing. Like either we buy them now or we buy them for way more later.
Yeah.
And so that'll change the industry very, very rapidly.
Interesting. And for the better, do you think, or what? Just
Well, if you're small pharma, definitely for the
for
better
the
because
better.
it'll drive up valuations for sort of everybody.
Yeah.
You kind of if you're in small pharma, you kind of have or biotech, you have the
Mhm.
perfect storm. you have high rates, hard to raise money. Most of the companies are not like ours. They don't have a revenue stream of any kind. And so they're really just burning and trying to stay alive long enough to get acquired and to do their clinical work. And then you don't have anybody getting acquired, which is sort of what drives valuation for small pharma. So the moment that that prices go up, FOMO starts happening, big pharma starts buying it, you get like a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle, and everything starts to bloom again.
That makes sense. All right. Very interesting. All right. Well, then as we're sort of wrapping up a little bit, would love to know, I feel like if there's something that people misunderstand as investors who are investing in psychedelic medicine, or if there are people who misunderstand sort of the psychedelic medicine element, would love to clear up sort of, I don't know, what's something that's most commonly misunderstood that you would like to kind of make sure people understand?
God. Yeah. I know like a lot of people just, there's two kinds of people. There's people who invest in this because it's MDMA and like they're cool and they want to invest in MDMA, and I'm down with those people. God knows, like I'm the funnest guy at every dinner party.
Sure.
But really, I think that there's not enough people who take a serious biotech lens to this. And we do. Like if you look at our branding and our positioning and everything we do, we're hyper serious about what we do. These things are sort of at odds with each other, obviously. Like we want to make the jokes and we want to talk about the fact that I make MDMA for a living.
Sure.
But at the heart of it, it is serious people trying to solve a really serious problem. And we're allowed to have fun while we do it. But my push is always to drive more serious, fundamental and institutional investors to this space, because the growth is great. It's like 100% growth year over year for a biotech or pharmaceutical company. If you can drive that kind of growth for 3-4 years, that ramps very, very quickly.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. With those sort of larger investors, institutional investors, are they focused in on really understanding the science? Is it just looking at a company from sort of like
they're just not ready to jump yet. They're
Okay.
like, every large institutional investor will tell you like, oh, we care about the science. No, they care about market size. Like, let's be real here. Like they all jumped into cannabis. Why?
Yeah.
Because like it was big. And so if it gets big enough, with all due respect to our friends and institutions, they will jump in happily as long as it's big enough to wet their whistle, so to speak.
That sounds good. Well, again, hopefully we're building towards that area soon enough.
For sure.
All right, real quick, seeing some interesting questions come through. It's like pharmacy is such a strange sector. I don't think I'll ever understand. I'm also a person that's fair. I think that's fair.
You are not our target market. I don't know what to tell you. If you don't take ibuprofen, then like
that's very fair. But again, hopefully, I mean, side notes, any thought on, I guess that's sort of more on the mushroom side.
So Amanita is not psilocybin. It's a different mushroom. I will say there's a great company called Psyched Wellness that focuses on Amanita. I spent some time on their board. I've just recently exited as of their AGM. I'm not running again for the board. But there's good companies in this space. I think more of a recreational product than a medical product, but
part of the okay, that's very interesting.
Not controlled.
All right.
It's not controlled.
Not controlled. I think that it's able to be sold online and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, then I guess sort of heading through to the close, would love to have you tell us where people can kind of stay in tune with what you guys are doing at PharmAla and everything.
So we trade on the CSE under the ticker MDMA, my favorite ticker of all time. In the OTC, we're on MDXXF, MDXX being the drug class that MDMA is a part of. Obviously, sign up for our email list and stuff. We put out a lot of news all the time, and it's always substantive. And then, of course, I'm out here. I'm out here. I'm talking. We're doing stuff. So yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate all the education and insight, because I think it is definitely an interesting sector and an emerging industry that I think just needs more research and more sort of education elements, whether that's things like this or obviously in more controlled studies and things like that. So hopefully we are making the way to do it. So appreciate you taking the time. All right. With all that said, thanks so much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to have you on soon. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.